All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the 50th issue of the International Macro Online History Series, hosted by CEPR. I'm very delighted to be the host of this session. So the guest tonight will be Marco Tabellini from Harvard Business School. And he will present a paper joined with Paola Giuliano on the seeds of ideology, historical immigration and political preferences in the United States. This is part of Marco's longer and bigger and incredibly interesting research agenda on immigration in the US, the political economy of it, and the long-run evolution of attitudes. And I've been a big follower of this agenda over the last years, and I'm very excited to see this presentation. So we'll do this according to the usual rules. Marco will speak for about 40 minutes, and I encourage all the listeners to ask their questions in the Q&A, and I will relate the questions to Marco at the end. We'll have 20 minutes for discussion at the end, but of course, if there are clarification questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A as well, and I will relay them to Marco. So Marco, it's a pleasure to have you here. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Davide, and thanks everyone for joining and for inviting me. I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to present my work with Paola Giuliano. Let me share the screen and see if it works. You see the slides? Perfect. Let me make this full screen. Okay, perfect. So this is, as Davide already said, this is joint work with Paola Giuliano, who's at UCLA Anderson. And let me start and jump into the presentation. So we study the long-run effects of immigration on American political ideology. And to do that, we focus on the age of mass migration when approximately 30 million European immigrants moved from the old world to the United States. And we ask the following question, which is whether European immigrants influence the political ideology and in particular preferences for a distribution of the American electorate in the long run. And by long run, I mean today, literally after the 2000s, to measure American respondents, American citizens' preferences for distribution, we use a large-scale national representative survey data from the CCS. I'll talk about this later. And in a nutshell, we are going to exploit variation in the presence of European immigrants across US counties. For those who are not familiar with the US geography, there are around 3,000 counties in the US. Between 1910 and 1930, we'll combine historical settlements of different immigrant groups from different European countries in 1900 with nationwide migration flows across countries in Europe to the United States after 1900. And of course, I'll be much more specific about our empirical strategy later, but this is a nutshell how you should think about the variation we'll be exploiting. We'll be combining these historical changes in immigration, which combine the cross-sectional distribution of immigrants with the time series distribution of migration flow at the national level. And we'll combine this with the preferences that we observe today, almost 100 years after this shock, among American-born individuals in this CCS. Ex ante, we think that the question of whether whether immigration from Europe changed the American political ideology in the long run in one direction or in another one is ambiguous. So on the one hand, we know that there's a negative correlation between ethnic diversity and preferences for distribution. Moreover, the immigrant background of the American working class has been said to be one of the reasons why socialism in the US never really emerged as instead happened in the European countries. On the other hand, we know that the long and the short-term effects of diversity might be very different. Under certain conditions, the contact hypothesis might be at work, namely repeated interactions between immigrants and natives might lead the natives and the majority group to accept the outgroup, the immigrants. Immigrants have been shown in several works, including that of Rana Braminsky and Lia Bustan, to assimilate over time to the country, in particular the United States, where they live in. And then it's possible, and this is something that has not been documented much before, to the best of our knowledge, that there are spillovers of culture and political preferences from the immigrants to the natives. The additional point that we want to emphasize, and I'll come back to this several times in the talk, is that immigrants from Europe were exposed to the introduction of the first social welfare reforms around the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And so they might have been exposed relative to the American counterpart to the expansion of the welfare state much more than either immigrants arrived before, say, 1880, or those that had been in the US for longer. Indeed, if you look at historical narrative, you see that many Europeans were often members and founders of the socialist movements in the United States. The Germans and the Swedish immigrants are just two examples. And let me review our findings. Basically, we find that American-born respondents that live today in countries that historically received more European immigrants are more likely to hold a liberal ideology and vote for the Democratic Party. They have stronger preferences for distribution. And these are large effects which are comparable to that of race or income, which for the United States at least have been documented, been shown to be among the strongest predictors of preferences for distribution. Now, these findings are somewhat in contrast with several of the results obtained by the growing political economy literature on the effects of immigration in the short run on political preferences. And so the second part of the paper and today's presentation will be about explaining why we find these results and explore the mechanisms. And we argue, and I try to convince you today, that immigrants brought with them preferences for distribution and a process of both vertical, but importantly horizontal transmission facilitated the spread of the immigrants' ideology to the native-born population. In addition to this intergroup contact and horizontal transmission, I will show you some results which suggest that the political mobilization of immigrants were important to favor the transmission of ideology. On the one hand, we show the immigrants' demand were already apparent during the New Deal period. And I will show you towards the end of the presentation that some of the effects of from immigrants to natives were mediated by the election of politicians who were more likely to support pro-redistribution bills. So let me sketch the outline of the presentation. First, I will tell you a little bit about the background and the age of mass migration. Then we'll jump into the data and the empirical strategy, and we'll see the main results. And then the second part of the presentation will be about the mechanisms and try to understand how and why European immigrants shifted to the left American ideology. We'll also try to connect the past to the present, and I'll show you some graphs on the evolution of political preferences over time from basically 1900 to today. All right, so it's not surprising maybe today we know that the United States has a large immigrant share, which is approximately 14% of the population. This is what I'm showing you in this slide. But this is not the first time that it happens. In the age of mass migration, which typically historians refers to as between 1850 and 1920 or 1930, the immigrant share of the population was as high as today. And the historical European immigration until 1915 was completely unrestricted. In fact, until 1917, when the United States introduced for the first time a literacy test that aimed at allowing basically immigrants to enter the country only if they were able to read and write. Before that, immigration was restricted on the basis of race and country of origin for Chinese immigrants in 1882, but for European immigrants, no quotas existed until the 1920s, 1921, 1924. I'll tell you a little bit more in a couple of slides. But basically, you can think that until World War I, there was no obstacle of whatsoever other than being able to pay for the trip to come to the United States. And between 1850 and 1890, most European immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, including Germany, the UK, Ireland, and Scandinavia. After 1890, with improved technology and declining the cost of shipping, as well as with growing incomes in Southern and Eastern Europe, many European periphery countries started to send their migrants over to the United States, and this included also the Russian Empire and the subsequent countries that emerged after that. Here, I'm showing you the share of the foreign-born living in the United States who came from different regions over time, between 1870 and 1930. So what you see here is roughly consistent with what I told you. At the onset of the age of mass migration, here I'm starting from the 1870, but of course, going back to 1850 doesn't change much. More than 85% of all immigrants in the United States came from Northern and Western Europe. The share coming from Southern and Eastern Europe was tiny, about 3 or 4%. As we move forward in time, the share of Southern and Eastern European immigrants increases, in particular after 1900, and keeps growing until the 1920s. So here I'm showing you the stock of immigrants, which implies that after 1890, the flow coming from Southern and Eastern Europe were much, much larger than those coming from Northern and Western Europe. And here I'm showing you the number of immigrants in thousands entering the United States in each year. As you can see, after 1890, the immigrant flows from Europe to the United States skyrocketed, and in some years they were even larger than 1 million per year. The flows suddenly stopped because of World War I. Then they resumed for a couple of years afterwards, but then in 1921 and 1924, US Congress passed the Immigration Acts that introduced quotas that limited the number of immigrants from each country that could enter the United States. And the quotas were designed in a way that countries that had sent more immigrants between 1910 and 1900 and 1920 were penalized. So the goal of the quotas was to restrict the access to the United States for countries like Italy, Poland, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe in general, to the advantage of those countries that instead had been sending more migrants before 1900, so the Northern and Western European immigrants. And I'm emphasizing this because World War I and the quotas create a trend break in not only in the number of immigrants, but also in the type of immigrants, type meaning the country they came from, which is useful for two reasons. First, because it means since immigrants came from countries with different political preferences, it means the different people with different preferences came over time. And also, and importantly for the identification strategy, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides, this is important because it allows us to exploit variation across types of immigrants over time, exploiting this shift share methodology, which I'll talk about, which is based on the cross-sectional distribution of different origin immigrants from different origins, compounded and combined with the arrival of new immigrants from those countries. And so if there are a lot of Italians in Boston, the intuition will be that they will all go to Boston, the new Italians. And if there are many Germans to Milwaukee, the new Germans that arrive will go to Milwaukee. Now, because the quotas favor the Germans relative to the Italians, and because the Germans came in smaller numbers than the Italians until 1915, we'll have that after the quotas, and to some extent World War I, different groups arrive in larger numbers, meaning that the places where these groups were living to begin with receive different shocks over time. Now, before explaining this formally, let me just share with you in one slide why we think European immigrants might have moved American ideology to the left. First, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, Europeans, especially after 1900, were more left-leaning than Americans. On the one hand, as work by Sam Vazzi and co-authors have shown, the American frontier culture had fostered the prevalence of ranked individualism. Second, and related, many European countries started to introduce social welfare reforms. You can think these were public education programs, pensions, social welfare. The Bismarck reform of the 1880s is perhaps the most emblematic example, but many other examples exist as well. And then we argue, and this will be the second part of the talk, that the Europeans transmitted their liberal ideology both vertically, namely to second, third, and fourth generation immigrants, and horizontally, namely to those natives that were already living in the country and to their kids when the European immigrants arrived. And then we argue that this was compounded by the political mobilization of immigrants who were often members and founders of the socialist movement in the United States and were gradually incorporated in the democratic voting bloc, shifting the platform to the left. And this is just one example where I'm showing you two former European immigrants who were very active in the political landscape and important candidates in the Socialist Party in the 1912 election. So let me be brief here, but we collect data from a variety of sources and we combine two main sources. On the one hand, the full country census of population between 1900 and 1930, which allows us to measure immigration, demographic characteristics, economic county level data. And we merge this with contemporaneous data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies, which is a large and nationally representative survey data set that includes questions about preferences for distribution and political ideology from 2006, and actually in the current version of the paper we have until 2018, but in fact the results I show you today go until 2020. This is a map of the average immigrant share in each US county between 1910 and 1930. Darker colors reflect a larger presence of historical European immigrants. And as you can see, most immigrants settled in the US Northeast, in the Midwest, and in the West. Fewer of them moved to the US South. And this is consistent with the fact that the economic landscape in the northern and western US was more appealing than in the South at the time. And this is the empirical strategy that we implement. So we are estimating individual level regressions, where I is the individual respondent, C stands for county of residence, S is the state, and T is the survey year. And we regress this against state and survey weight fixed effects, a host of historical 1900 controls, all measured before the arrival of European immigrants in our setting, and a bunch of individual controls for the respondents, and crucially, the average immigrant share in the county population between 1910 and 1930. So this is the number of European immigrants between 1910 and 1930 divided by county population over the same period. Let me emphasize that we focus specifically on immigrants arrived after 1900 for two reasons. First, because we think these were the immigrants, and in fact, we show this in the paper. I don't know if I have time to show this in the presentation, but we show that these are the immigrants that matter in terms of the transmission of ideologies. It's consistent with the idea I mentioned before, namely European immigrants after 1900 were more likely to have been exposed to these social welfare reforms. The second is more of a, is driven by the empirical design and the construction of the instrument for European immigration, which I'll turn to next, which is here. So basically, to avoid the concern that immigrants with different sets of preferences move to counties that were already more liberal, or where the economy was such that the liberal ideology was more likely to prevail, we use different versions of the ship-sharing instrument methodology, which is being introduced by Altonji and Carr in 1991, and then refined by Carr in 2001. The logic is that we interact the share of immigrants from country J in county C in 1900 with the number of immigrants that arrived in the United States in each decade after 1900 until 1930 from country J, and we leave out those that settled in county C. We sum this over all countries J, and we scale this by population in account. This is a standard shifter instrument, which has been largely used in the literature. This is a flow, so this is the predicted number of immigrants arrived in a given decade. And we then recover the average predicted immigrant share by recursively adding this until 1930. Now, in the interest of time, I will not go through the alternative instrument that we have in the new version of the paper, which is not the one posted online, we're still working on it. Basically, we can exploit the timing of expansion of the railroads across counties with the timing of arrival of different immigrant groups before 1900, and this to predict the initial distribution of immigrants, and then we interact this with subsequent arrival of European immigrants after 1900. But let me skip this. I'm happy to take questions after my 35 minutes of the presentation if there are questions on identification. In the remaining 15 minutes, let me instead tell you more about the results and the mechanism. So here I estimate the equation I showed you before, where the dependent variable is some measure of political preference of American-born respondents in a given survey year. All values are such that or variables are such that higher values refer to a more liberal, more democratic ideology. And so what you see here, focusing on panel B, which is where we present the baseline ID results, an average larger immigrant share is associated with stronger political preferences in support of the Democratic Party and more liberal ideology. And in particular, a 5 percentage point increase in immigration, which is roughly the average in our sample, is associated with a 6% increase in the probability of identifying with the Democratic Party among American-born respondents today. Similar results hold for preferences for distribution. So here, the dependent variable is one of the different proxies that the literature has used to measure preferences for distribution. And what you see is that across the board, immigrants are associated with, or large counties that historically received more European immigrants have respondents who are more likely to support a larger role of the state and who have stronger preferences for distribution. And the magnitude is again large relative to what the existing literature has found. So a 5 percentage point increase in immigration increases support for a distribution by about 3%. Okay? And let me just mention that OLS and ID results are very similar, and I might come back to potential questions for this on why, if we were worried about the potential endogeneity of immigrants, we find that there is no differential effect between OLS and ID. One potential answer is that immigrants sorted along economic lines, and that this was disconnected from the evolution of political preferences. Another one is that there are offsetting forces. So, for example, on the one hand, immigrants might have moved to places that were growing more, but at the same time, these places might have also been more subject to crowding out. And so for immigrants to settle in these places might have been harder. And so these two forces cancel each other out. Let me skip the robustness check. Let me just say that our results are robust to a number of different specifications, and a couple just that I think are important, that to controlling for other and subsequent waves of migration, such as the Great Migration of African Americans or the Mexican migration post-1970. But let me skip and jump into the mechanisms in the remaining 10 minutes. So I argue, and now I try to convince you, that immigrants brought their preferences with them, and immigrants left from Europe from countries that were more left-leaning and had already introduced some social welfare reforms, and these preferences gradually spilled over onto natives. This was reinforced, we'll argue and show, by political mobilization of immigrants. Now, how do we test this hypothesis? We exploit the fact that different European countries introduce social welfare programs at different points in time, and that different European immigrants arrive in the United States at different points in time as well. And the logic is thus that we can construct an index that tells us how much of the preferences for how much of the social welfare reforms that were introduced in Europe were kind of transmitted to the United States through immigration. The logic being that early reforms should be associated with stronger support for distribution, which is something that indeed we test in the data and we validate. And so basically, you can think of an index that we are constructing as the average exposure at the county level that combines two parts. One is the number of years of exposure that to reforms that European immigrants brought with them. So an Italian who moved in 1910 brought with her the number of years of exposure to different social welfare reforms, depending on the number of when the reforms were introduced in Italy. We consider different sets of reforms in the paper, but just to give you an idea, these are education reform, pension reforms, social insurance, and healthcare reforms. And then we average these preferences, these reforms, by the number of immigrants, in particular by their shares, from each country living in each country. So let me actually show you formally how this is constructed. So basically, you can think of this PRJT in parentheses here as the number of years of exposure among the European immigrants from country J in year T in the United States. And we interact that with the local presence of European immigrants from J in county C in the year, right? So basically, you have a weighted average of the immigrant population with their respective preferences. And summing across all J's, all countries, and taking the average over the 3 decades, we basically obtain the average exposure in the county. And we instrument this using the standard Schiffer instrument methodology I mentioned before. Okay, so let me now show you the results that we obtain. Our conjecture is that if our results depend on exposure to welfare reforms, the immigrants that arrived from countries with more reforms should have a stronger effect. And so what we do here is we split our sample in counties with the average index that I showed you in the previous slide, above and below the sample median. The orange bars reflect results obtained for counties with exposure to social welfare reforms above the median. And this exposure, again, is the average, right, of the exposure that the European immigrants settling in those counties had in their country of origin. What you see is that the effects of immigration are larger systematically in counties where the average immigrant from Europe had been exposed to social welfare reforms for longer. And although not always, in many cases, these differences are not only quantitatively large, but also statistically significant. Now, in the paper, we provide evidence that vertical transmission cannot be the main channel. And I come back to the Q&A if there are questions on this. Let me tell you instead what we find to foster our interpretation of intergroup contact and horizontal transmission. So we argue and find that the effects are stronger when intergroup contact between the immigrants and the natives of native parentage are stronger. And so we use different proxies. We use intermarriage between an immigrant and a native of native parentage, as well as the probability that an immigrant lives close by, literally next door, to a native of native parentage. This is made possible by the very detailed full count data that we use. So basically, the results suggest that counties where intermarriage and residential integration were more prevalent saw stronger effects. We don't instead find heterogeneity across immigrants' economic characteristics or county characteristics, suggesting that it didn't matter really where the immigrants came from, and where the immigrants settled, and it didn't matter what economic characteristics they had. What mattered was instead how often they interacted with natives, and as per the previous slide, how long they had been exposed to social welfare. And then we show a bunch of political results. We show that the arrival of European immigrants was associated with stronger support for the Progressive Party in the 1924 elections, when the Progressive Party was openly endorsed by the Socialist Party and the labor movement. And we can trace out, or at least provide evidence for the diffusion of ethnic socialist newspapers in counties that received more European. And finally, we provide evidence for social transmission mechanisms. So we find that native of native parentage gave to their native-born kids names that were more likely to be common among immigrants and that were more prevalent among socialists in Europe. So we compiled a list of prominent socialist figures such as Karl Marx, just one example, but basically we have a list of 20 names, about 20 names from different sources in Europe among the most prominent socialist figures. And we find that native of native parentage kids receive more socialist and immigrant sounding names in counties that receive more European names. I think I have only 2 or 3 minutes left. So let me share a couple of slides to show you the evolution of these patterns over time. So here, what I'm showing you are the effects of European immigration between 1910 and 1930 on the democratic vote share between 1900 and 2020 in each separate election. Of course, one should be careful in interpreting the meaning of the democratic vote share before the racial realignment of the 1960s, but which actually started earlier in the 30s and 40s in the North. But what I want to emphasize here are 2 things. First, before 1924, you see no positive relationship between, in fact, no statistically significant relationship except for 1920, between the European immigrant share and the democratic vote share in a county, suggesting that there are no pre-trends. The coefficient jumps in a very peculiar election, that of 1928, which is when Al Smith was the first Roman Catholic with European immigrant background who ran for presidency as a candidate for the Democratic Party. Interestingly enough, that year, the candidate that was running for the Republican Party, Hoover, was running on a platform based on individualism. And so it's interesting to see that precisely when there is this first European form, he was not a first-generation immigrant, but like a descendant of the European immigrants running for office, running for president, and when the opponent was running on a political platform that emphasized individualism, you see the jump in the relationship between European immigration and support for the Democratic Party. And this goes ups and downs and cycles over time, but roughly remains strongly positive until today. And indeed, our results are consistent with what historians have been saying, namely that Al Smith was responsible for bringing the children of the new immigration into an increasingly welfare-oriented Democratic Party. I don't have time to show you formally the results, but we also observed that conditional on the severity of the crisis, counties that received more European immigrants had stronger relief, received stronger spending during the New Deal, consistent with there being more latent demand for a distribution. And lastly, before concluding, I want to show you a potential additional mechanism, which is the mediation and the mediating role of elected politicians. So here we are turning to the probability of voting for a redistribution in favor of a redistribution bill by an elected candidate, elected representative of the House, as a function of the European immigrant share in the district of the elected member. And what you see is that until the late 20s, there's no relationship between European immigration and the probability of voting in favor of the distribution bills. This probability becomes positive and statistically significant from the late 30s onwards. Note that here there are, of course, fewer points in time because there are not bills on redistribution being passed or voted upon in each year. And so we focus on those years where such bills were voted upon. There are a few points in time where the coefficient becomes close to 0. These are years, interestingly enough, in which the president is a Republican. There are cases in which a Republican president is still associated with a positive relationship between the probability of voting for a pro-redistribution bill and the average presence of historical immigration. But still, the pattern that we observe is consistent with, again, European immigrants influencing the behavior, political behavior, in this case of politicians, to push for more redistribution deals. And these just, and then I conclude, these are all, or 95% of the elected officials in this case are native of native parentage. So these are not second or third of European immigrant descendants. We can't go over the third generation because we don't have the data, but this suggests that this is not the immigrants directly being elected into office that are driving these results. Okay, let me conclude, and then I think with Davide we can open the floor to the discussion. What I hope that you remember from today's talk is that European immigration moved American political ideology to the left, and that US-born individuals that today live in counties that received more immigrants historically hold a more left-leaning ideology and have strong preferences for distribution. And we argued, I hope I convinced at least some of you, that immigrants brought with them preferences for distribution and more liberal ideology, which were transmitted to natives. And such transmission was fostered by intergroup interactions and was reinforced by the political inclusion of immigrants. I think the two main takeaways from the paper are that it's key to distinguish between the short and the long run effects of diversity, and that the direction and strength of spillovers might depend on the preferences of the immigrants vis-a-vis those of the natives, and on the malleability of local culture, as well as on the immigrants' incentives to retain their own preferences. With this, I want to conclude and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this paper, and I'll leave it to Davide to moderate the discussion.
All right, well, thank you so much, Marco, for this wonderful presentation. As I said before, a very, very inspiring research agenda. Seems like my video is frozen. Let me try to start it again. So let me remind the attendants that you can ask questions in the Q&A. So some of you are raising hands. The way to ask questions, actually type it in the Q&A, and then I'll read it aloud. Let me emphasize again, how much I also like your pitch, especially, this idea that we do need to think about the long run impact of immigration. We always are very focused in our political debate, in our strategizing among political parties these days on very short-run effects, but it's interesting to think about what immigrants do to the political equilibrium in a certain place in the very long run. So that's what we should definitely think about. So Eugene White would like to ask a question live. So let me see if I can allow you to talk. Yes, so I'm trying to unmute you.
That works. Does that work?
Yes, it's working. Eugene, welcome. Please ask your question.
Yeah, the reason is typing something in, it may sound very different than actually speaking it, because I was going to congratulate you on a very useful study for supporting the right-wing MAGA nativists, as it certainly would fuel their agenda. But more seriously, there's one, and I understand speaking very quickly about these things, one has to be very careful. You said that immigrants on the socialist ticket for president in 1912, you can't be an immigrant and be a candidate for president. That's a small thing.
Yeah, that was a mistake on my side.
I know, that's why I say going fast. But it's a couple of points, is that, first of all, immigrants may migrate to places which are favorable to them. And that's a big point. They don't go to the South, and there's a reason for that. And that's not a friendly place. In fact, there's a huge lynching of Italians, which is why we have Columbus Day, in fact, in the South. So they tend to avoid the South, which means they're maybe reinforcing the ideologies already present. So there's a little endogeneity. The second thing is I have trouble with treating immigrants from a country as homogeneous. And I can't think of a better problem than Ireland, where the difference between the Protestants and Catholics have very marked, and even between the subdivisions of Protestants, Presbyterians, and Church of England, Church of Ireland. So that's, and I'm sure that in Germany you would find great variance. And I think that's something one ought to at least acknowledge, if not try and control for. But I think those are the two. And then exposure, for instance, to welfare reforms in a country, not everyone benefited. So there, we want to think of, because these are not your characterizations, correct? In terms of ranking welfare reforms and so forth.
Yeah.
If these-
So thank you very much, Eugene,
and,
for the
and yes, okay. I'll leave it at that.
So first of all, yes, you're right. Those were second-generation immigrants and not first-generation immigrants running for office in 1920 and 1912. That's thanks for the clarification. On your various point, I agree 100% that, of course, there's a key endogeneity issue, which, in the interest of time, I kind of went very quickly over it, and that's why we construct an instrument to address it. Namely, immigrants might have moved to places where natives were already more open to them. We try to deal with this in many different ways. I think the graph that I showed you already provided some support in favor of our identification strategy, namely, the instrument is not correlated with the democratic vote share before 1928. Of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's very important to interpret the democratic vote share carefully. Let me just mention, I didn't say this in the presentation, results are robust if we drop the South, which if we think of like democratic vote share and preferences for distribution and the like, one may be worried are kind of driven by the preferences and the specific history of the region. And in the paper, we do a bunch of checks to show you that you can control basically for all the 1900 controls that you can think of, such as average manufacturing share, the democratic vote share, the progressive party vote share, and so on, before or like at the beginning of 1900, and the results are very, very stable. The issue you are raising is important, especially because we, except for the democratic vote share, we don't observe directly the CCS preferences back then in 1900. So we can't really test for pre-trends formally. And that's why we use the democratic vote share, and that's the graph on the past, from the past to the present, as a way to say, okay, at least on the margins that we can measure, these are, we don't see any differential effect. And the stability of coefficients, as we add more and more controls, suggests that we are not picking up underlying trends. Now, there is another important point which we're making, which is, of course, these countries, the immigrants from the same country are not homogeneous, and the reforms might have benefited different groups differentially, as well as they might have triggered a selection of immigrants in different ways. We don't have a way to tackle this directly, of course. And so I think that, if anything, would add noise to our measure. We do have a set of results where we do control for religious diversity, and results go through. The German case is an important point, and of course, some Germans were coming from Catholic regions and others from Protestant regions, so that's also a tricky part. We can't really decompose that because, unfortunately, data we don't have enough. But so my short answer, and probably to you not fully satisfactory, to your question, is that these heterogeneities that we are neglecting are, if anything, adding noise, and the fact that we do find these results it speaks in favor of our proposed mechanism. And to some extent, we are not so much interested on the process of selection of those leaving Europe. We are really just interested in understanding, given the people arrived, those that arrived had their preferences, and so how these preferences shifted the political ideology of the natives. So this is how Paul and I are thinking about it.
All right, thank you, Marco. If I can, meanwhile, while I keep encouraging you asking questions in the Q&A, if I can continue a little bit on Eugene's last point on the exposure to welfare reforms. If I remember correctly from reading the paper, it is both welfare and education reforms, right? So it's expansion of the welfare state, but that begins in Germany, as we know, with the Bismarck reforms in the 1880s, and even then it covers only a small set of the population. Whereas I guess you have more bite coming from the educational reforms, but then I guess the natural alternative interpretation is that these are more educated people coming in, and maybe that shifts their preferences. Would that be a reasonable interpretation, or how should I think about that?
That's a great point, Davide. Yes, so the alternative interpretation would be perhaps people are more educated, and because of that, they demand more distribution. Is that what you're thinking of? Like, So I think we cannot fully rule out this interpretation, other than pointing to some of the anecdotal, not anecdotal, but a suggestive evidence we have. For example, we have this result on the fact that European immigrants increase the probability that natives give to their kids more socialist sounding names, and that the places that receive more European immigrants saw a larger increase in ethnic socialist newspapers. So we have this direct link between socialism and European immigrants. If anything, there is a paper that I'm pretty sure you are aware of by Oriana Bandiera and co-authors on the Economic Journal that shows that the arrival of European immigrants increased schooling, spending on schooling at the state level in a way that was negatively correlated with the exposure that these immigrants had. So Oriana's and co-authors paper is basically, the argument there is the US states were doing this kind of basically as a to have a nation building project. And so I'm thinking out loud, I think this would not be fully consistent with what you had in mind. But at the same time, I agree with you that we cannot rule out the education reform having a direct effect on human capital, and instead switch in preferences for distribution. Other than this is compounded by the problem that we can't control for the number of years of education of immigrants. So what I was going to say is we do see these results holding even when you essentially control for European immigrants' characteristics, such as skills, the type of jobs, and their language proficiency, but we don't, and literacy, but we don't have the number of years of education. So we can't really, I think, nail down what you're thinking about.
Okay, so we have a question by Rui, and then we have a question in the Q&A by Alejandra. So Rui, why don't you start?
If I may, there are actually two questions. So the first one piggyback precisely on the previous one. So, and this is about the incentives for immigrants to move to the US and the fact that they actually may be influenced by these social welfare reforms back in Europe. One of my courses has an old paper who tries to argue that Bismarck's social welfare reforms essentially killed German immigration to the US, right? Sort of negative selecting immigration, right? So the few that perhaps kept on living weren't affected, weren't interested in this kind of social welfare provision. So it can work, whereas you pin down everything under the assumption that people just bring to the US preferences for the social welfare that they were exposed back in Europe, but you have to see also what were the incentives for them to move. Then the other question, it's not a question. You said that if wished, you would speculate a little bit more about why the OLS and 2LS and the IV results are so similar. Indeed, right? So you catalog the different alternatives. So maybe there was really no endogeneity, maybe there were countervailing effects. But a third possible alternative is that there might be a problem with the exclusion restriction. And I'm thinking here on the very well-known friends and family effect, right? So once Swedes started going to Minnesota, they just kept on going, right? So if you use the US-wide share of Swedes immigration, it's the same as using the Minnesota and Wisconsin-wide share of Swedes immigration, because that's where they'll go, right? So it's also conceivable that they went there not only because they knew they were going to find familiar churches and Swedish-speaking people, but also Swedish voting people, right? But you're using a shift share instrument, right? That doesn't deal with this local clustering. Right, so can you elaborate on that as well?
Absolutely, thank you very much. These are both great points. The first one is, I agree with you, there might be selection. And in fact, the selection that I would expect is going on is exactly what Rui was saying, basically should go against us. So the immigrants leaving from Germany would be, if we think of a framework of exit and voice, should be precisely those that don't like the Bismarck reforms. And so, if anything, our results should be a lower bound for the effects of the European immigration, because we are capturing the effects of immigration among those immigrants that were negatively selected in terms of their preferences for distribution, which still is probably more to the left than the set of preferences for distribution that the average individual living in the United States had back then. On the exclusion restriction and the validity of the instrument, absolutely. So we are relying on the shift share methodology, and to get rid of or address as best as we can the issues that Rui was mentioning, we do a couple of things. First, rather than using when I predict the number of immigrants from, say, Sweden going to Milwaukee, I'm not using in the flows those immigrants that eventually settled in Milwaukee, precisely because I want to get rid of that endogeneity. Second, we replace the actual flows with the flows predicted by weather shocks in Europe. And so I'm not using the number of immigrants from Sweden to say how many, I'm not using the actual number of immigrants from Sweden, but I'm predicting how many of them would have left because of the weather shock. So this is something that previous work has done, such as also Nancy Kian, Sandra Sequeira, and Nathan. Now, there's another point which is very important. What Rui says is, okay, but these are all the things I told you about is the OJT component. So it's the flow component, it's not the share. The issue that Rui was mentioning is, okay, but then once these guys arrive at Ellis Island, they decide where to go based on where other people from their origins. And so we are trying to get around this using I didn't have time to go through this quickly, and it's not in the current version of the paper, but basically we now have an additional instrument which combines or actually expands on the shift share methodology. And rather than using the actual immigrant share in 1900, it predicts them using the national inflows in each decade between 1860 and 1900, so national level, no county component, with the timing of expansion of the railroad across counties. And so basically the intuition, this is not our intuition, this intuition of Sandra, Nathan, and Nancy, the intuition is that if there is a year, like a decade, in which many immigrants came from Germany, say 1870, and that year saw the connection of a specific set of counties to the railroad, then it's more likely than that those counties will receive a lot of Germans because those counties were more likely to be reached by the immigrants that arrived there. And so basically, we are then, when it comes to 1910 and 1920, we are not using the actual distribution of immigrants in 1900, but we are using the predicted one, which happens to be positively correlated with the actual one, used in this methodology. And so the actual presence of the immigrants in Milwaukee from a given country in Europe is no longer taken into account, and we should get rid, at least in part, that's what we argue, of the endogeneity concern that we mentioned.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. I read it aloud. It's from Alejandra Rigoin. She's asking, I quote, how is it that you define redistribution here? Is it by means of expanding spending or by taxing incomes, or is it a mix? Looking at how countries of origin moved in the period that you study, one could conclude that populism, rather than a more liberal and democratic polity, your words, resulted. And that may fit with one interpretation of the economic policies of the Progressive Party in the US, not that I subscribe to it.
Thank you very much, Alejandra, for the question. So this is an important point. There are a couple of answers to that. In the data, what we measure today, so when I talk about political ideology, this is the standard in the literature of preferences for distribution in political ideology, namely, this is a 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 scale, with higher values reflecting more support for taxation or for redistribution. I showed you results for both. It's possible that basically what we are capturing, take today, like in the US, these are Bernie Sanders supporters and not the more moderate Democrats, so more on the left. We can't really rule out that. So this is a good point that we haven't tackled. One way would be to check whether this is really what's going on, is perhaps look at the distribution of these responses more directly, in the sense of like considering differently those that are very, very strong in terms of preferences for redistribution versus those that are moderate. We haven't done that, and we could. Historically, we don't observe preferences for redistribution of either immigrants or natives, and it's totally possible that some of the immigrants that moved to the United States, and that I said these are more liberal, were in fact what we would consider today as populist. And the socialist, in fact, the socialist party in the United States was at times, depending on the elections, but was quite on the left, was more on the left than the Democratic Party, for example. Then it gradually got absorbed in the Democratic Party, partly because the Democratic Party itself shifted its policy platform to the left. And so we can't really distinguish between populism and left-wing populism and liberal ideology in a moderate sense. So that's an interesting nuance that Paul and I had not thought about. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Alejandra. Alejandra is thanking you, actually. And if there are more questions, please let us know. We're 3 minutes. So if there's no question from the audience, let me just ask you a quick question to conclude maybe, but feel free to type more questions. A key concern always in these shift share instruments, in these kind of settings, is that you want to control for the pre-existing characteristics of the place that are, as Eugene said before, the ones that might attract people to a certain place to begin with. And so one of the things that you do is you control for the Democratic Party vote share in 1900. Is there anything else that you can do that we know about the ideology of places before 1900? One is, could go back and, thinking about what Alejandro just said, and, maybe see this as an expression of populism rather than left-leaning ideology. And then, look at votes for the populist party in that period. But is there anything, for example, about the labor movement or, anything else that, the key problem that you have is that you don't have, the pre and post. You can only look at attitudes now, but you can't look at attitudes in the 1880s. So is there anything else that you can offer to the audience?
Thank you, Davide. Yes, I didn't go fast and I didn't say this, but we do control for the vote share of the populist party and the vote share of also non-democratic party in the elections, basically between the late 1880s and 1910, 1912, and results are almost identical. So this is precisely to try and capture, because the Democratic Party vote share in 1900 did not reflect socialist preferences, and there were other instead parties that might have been better suited at that. So we do control for that, and results remain unchanged. We also this is not directly on ideology, but we look at what happens if we control for the average immigrant sounding name prevailing among natives, or if we control for average baseline intermarriage rates or integration, and we don't find any differential effect, suggesting that results are unlikely to pick up the sorting of immigrants into these more left-leaning places. Now, you gave me an idea, which we do have data on unionization rates for some years. So we don't use them in the analysis because they are so scattered around that we can't do that. But we could, and we do have data on early 20th century presence of labor unions. So we should check what happens if there is a correlation between our instrument and this pre-period presence of the strength of the labor movement. That's something we haven't done, and we should. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's one last quick question by Eugene. Eugene, do you want to ask it yourself, or shall I just read it aloud? You can unmute yourself.
I'll unmute myself. Yeah, so it's the following. To vote, did immigrants need to be naturalized? And one thing which I recall is that some of the natives wanted a 21-year waiting period before they could be naturalized, to mirror the 21 years that native-born would have before they could vote, which means that they did see this as an important way to control the voting of immigrants.
Indeed, yeah. So that's one of the arguments that we make in the paper is precisely that the political machines and the political parties at some point started to view the immigrants as a pivotal segment of the electorate, and they were responsive and they responded to the.
Do you know how many? Do you know how many? What the rule was, or was it by?
Yeah. So the rule was that at least after, I think I remember, I forgot if it was 1902 or 9, but it was early 20th century when basically what happened was that after 5 years, an immigrant was allowed to vote. So after 2 years from arrival, you could sign the first papers, which was basically nothing but say, okay, in a couple of years when I become eligible, I will be willing to register and become naturalized. And then at the end of the 5th year, you can sign like you didn't do. You never got rejected. So it was just an action of the immigrant to become naturalized. And often this was, especially the political machines in the big cities like New York, Boston, and so on, the party leaders would go, or the in the cities, they would go and try to convince immigrants to naturalize and exchange what are known as like patronage jobs, basically. So in many cases, there was this process, and there's work by Alison Schepzer, who's at Pittsburgh, that documents some of these interesting dynamics. So the rule was 5 years. And interestingly, if a native woman married an immigrant, she would, depending on when this happened, because of course the suffrage for women in the US was happening.
She could lose her status as a citizen.
Sorry?
She could lose her status as a citizen.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I was about to say exactly. But
okay,
yes,
well, thank you.
In short, I agree 100% that there was, and I think that some of the results that we show on the political party front are consistent with the incorporation of immigrants. That was something that was actively encouraged by the parties.
But my point for you econometrically is that it adds a lag to the time.
Yes, but then yes, I mean, but consider that we are looking at, so a couple of points. First, we are not saying that these are just the immigrants themselves voting. So in fact, we are arguing that this is only a part, so that the effect can be, in fact, if you look at the persistence of the effect, it's not decaying over time, which means that the ideology must be spreading around people and not just remain confined to the immigrants. And second, we have immigration, and we measure immigration as the average between 1910 and 1930 as the kind of the shock. And this is a shock that combines the effect of people now being able to vote and other people that were already able to vote that shift their preferences. And in fact, the fact that we see, I mean, European immigration that we measure starts in 1901, basically, but we see that the results start to change, and there's this positive spike in the democratic vote share only in 1928. So with a few decades of lag, which is consistent, because on the other hand, existing works has also shown that in the short run there was some backlash against European immigrants, which might have gone the opposite way.
Okay, well, thank you, Marco. So I think we should close the webinar part now. So thanks again for being here. Thanks for your presentation. It was lovely to see you presenting. Thanks for the audience, to the audience for engaging. We can stay in the Zoom room and keep up the discussion. So everyone who wants to stay in the Zoom room and we can have a conversation. To everyone who's been attending from outside, let me remind you of the next meeting. 2 weeks from now, the same venue, the National Macrohistory Online Seminar Series. 2 weeks from now, on the 20th of September, we'll have Francois Velde from FRB Chicago speaking about economic activity in San Francisco during the 1918 influenza pandemic, and Paul Rodi will be the chair. Thanks again to everybody. And then I guess we can just stay in and keep up the conversation if you want to stay in.
Thank you very much once again for all the comments and questions, and for the opportunity to present.
Okay. Nathan?
Thank you, Marco, for a very interesting presentation. I might have missed it, or maybe it's in the paper that I admit I didn't fully read. Do you have some breakdown, some interactions with country of origin? Because I mean, a substantial part of the immigrants you're looking at came from a couple of countries, for the later period, many Italy. And so is there any kind of variance in terms of these big countries of origin? I mean, I mean, there's probably a tale of smaller groups that migrated, but looking at the two, so it'd be like from Russia and so mainly Jews from. So I would say I would just look at, say, the Jews versus Italians maybe in that context, because the Jews ex post but also ex ante were more kind of liberal leaning to begin with. And these are one of the two large groups that emigrated during your sample. So have you attempted to do that?
So we haven't done systematically country by country. It might be interesting to look at this more carefully. We haven't thought about it. One issue may be empirically, we may not have a first stage to instrument separately for different groups, but that's a good idea. Just one point though, that it's true that Italians and Russians were large until 1917, but what I like of this setting, of course I'm biased because it's my paper, but with Paula, but what I think is one of the strengths of the paper is that, or the setting, is that after 1917, you have a complete reversal of the large sending countries. And so it's not true that in our sample, all immigrants, or most immigrants come from Italy and Eastern Europe. In fact, after 1917, and in particular between 1920 and 1930, the Italians cannot send that many immigrants. So their numbers are cut from even like 500,000 to 40,000 because of the quota. And so this is precisely where our empirical strategy has biased, because there is this external shock, which basically says, okay, there are only 40,000 slots are allowed to the Italians. And so having said, so this is just to say that there is much more variation that broadly stereotypically we think. Having said that, it's a good idea to break down results by macro region at least. I don't think, of course, we can, the very small country, we will not be able to pin down their effects, but for some large sending countries like Germany, Italy, the former Russian Empire, those are countries that we should separate and look at. That's the only decomposition we do is depending on the characteristics of these countries, but we never kind of say, okay, this is the Italians versus others. So that's a good point, Nathan.
Yeah, following up on that a little bit is so in terms of the dynamics, so you have the pre-1917, post-1917, do they migrate to the similar locations, but a different composition of migrants? I mean, because then there's the receiving. I mean, or it would be clean if there's a completely different counties, completely different states. So that would make it a nice break. But if their numbers are smaller, so they're
but that's exactly where the ship share helps us. Yeah. The ship share instrument helps us, because if you look at the settings of, say, the Germans, they are very, very different from the settings of the settlements of the Italians. So the Italians were concentrated in the cities in the northeast and the west, and there was some Italian communities in the south as well. The Germans were really in the Midwest. Same for the Swedes, and something similar happens to the Irish. The Irish again were in California, and they were in the northeast, like Boston, of course, Philadelphia, and so on. And so it's really the extent of geographic clustering combined with the shocks at different points in time to the national level that allows us to have places that are hit very different places being hit by different types of migrants over time. So that's the intuition.
Marcus, so David Mitch has a question. David, yeah. I think you can unmute yourself now.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask, and I don't think it applies to the time period that you're looking at, but one can identify some immigrant groups that are arguably more conservative, more right-leaning than the general population. I'm thinking of Cubans going into Miami, arguably maybe Basques going into Nevada, Idaho. And so it'd just be, if there's a large enough sample or impact, it would be interesting just for symmetry to look at those groups, whether they had spillover effects and made the
Yeah.
populations more conservative than otherwise, more Republican leaning.
That's an interesting point. Yes, so we did control for Mexican immigration after. So our sample basically, is, as you said, this is after our sample period. But this is interesting. Yes, I agree that we may want to check that. The other point that's one of the reasons why we haven't done it is because there are many other things changing. Not only the right left-leaning ideology, but also to some extent the perceived cultural distance, in the sense that the color of skin, we know that some is associated with how natives in the United States perceive immigrants, and the fact that perhaps not enough time has passed. Although anecdotally, it's very interesting to see, like, I agree with you that actually the Cubans voting right-wing is an interesting example that I hadn't thought about. I had in mind the Mexican immigration. It's something that we should definitely consider as an extension and in the paper. You're right. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I didn't see any more questions in the chat, in the Q&A. All right.
Can I just
yeah, Rui,
raise a curiosity, right? So, and this goes precisely towards the anti-immigration measures of the post-war. So could you use your results to simulate waving many hands, the political impact of the change, of the enforced change in the composition? So you use the European surveys on the exposure rather to welfare reforms. Could you try to simulate, you know, how much the Democratic Party, if you believe your results, was harmed over time
We can
by
see
these
so
discriminatory
basically
measures?
you're saying how much of the this is an interesting point. So correct me if I'm wrong. You're trying to say, can you quantify, of course, under some assumptions, the extent to which the shift in the Democratic Party to the left and the increase in preferences for distribution pushed by the Democratic Party can be explained by the European immigrants? Is that what you're thinking?
Or do the reverse, right? So you can do it either way, right? So imagine that there was no change in the open doors policy, right? And the Italians were allowed, and the German, you know, anyone
was
allowed to come in.
Yes, I see your point. Yes, we can definitely. That's an interesting point. Like, we know that there was this. I see. Yes, we know that there was this shock, and that many more Italians would have come. Now, the Italians would have had a different type of ideology than the immigrants that came. What would have been the ideological mix that would have been resulting?
This would be a back of the envelope, you know, right? Because then you also have to think about the supply side, right? The incentives to migrate after World War I.
Of course. This is interesting. We hadn't thought about Rui. Thanks a lot. It's an interesting exercise. Yeah, I'm writing a paper with Nancy Kian on a completely different topic, on the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we are trying to do a similar back of the envelope calculation for the economic impact that the Chinese excluded immigrants would have had. And now I hadn't thought about doing this in the context of the ideology. That's a great idea. Yeah.
All right. Well, lovely. Thanks, Rui, but thanks especially to Marco. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for engaging with the audience. I think I can speak for everybody that we've been very inspired by your presentation. It was a great discussion. So again, let me remind you, we'll meet again in 2 weeks. And bye-bye. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Rui.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank you,
Marco. Thank you, Davide.
for moderating the discussion, Davide. Thanks a lot. And see you all soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks for organizing. I'll leave. Bye.